30 days after Melissa told me I could remain in my own home only if I paid rent, she stood in my foyer holding a cardboard box with her framed wedding photographs inside, staring at the county deputy who had just handed her the final enforcement notice. She had spent weeks telling neighbors I was confused, fragile, incapable of managing my affairs. She had told church friends Daniel was protecting me. She had told everyone the house would soon be theirs. But lies have a way of collapsing all at once. What Melissa never knew was that Robert had placed this house, the land beneath it, and every improvement made over 32 years into an irrevocable family trust, and I was not merely a beneficiary. I was sole controlling trustee for life, with a poison pill clause my husband added after watching too many families tear themselves apart over greed. Any resident attempting to coerce, financially exploit, or displace the trustee forfeited every contingent inheritance connected to the estate. When Howard Briggs read the clause aloud in his office, Daniel looked as if the floor had shifted beneath him. Melissa laughed at first. Then Howard slid across the evidence she had not expected: the recorded messages about charging me rent, the emails where she discussed refinancing my house before I was even gone, the contractor estimates for renovating once the old woman is out, and the bank transfers showing she had been diverting shared household funds while claiming Daniel was covering the mortgage. Her face changed then. Not anger. Fear. The civil petition I filed did not ruin them. Their choices did. Melissa had to reimburse legal fees, return every dollar improperly taken from the joint household account, and pay damages tied to fraudulent occupancy claims. The Homeowners Association Board, where she loved to perform as the gracious community volunteer, removed her after the judgment became public record. The real estate firm where she had just accepted a part-time staging position quietly withdrew the offer after a background review. Even more painful to her than money was reputation. The woman who had whispered that I was a burden became known, in a town where people remember everything, as the daughter-in-law who tried to charge an elderly widow rent in her own house. Daniel lost something too, though not what he feared. He did not lose me. He lost the illusion that silence carries no price. On the 29th day, he came back alone. No lawyer. No Melissa. Just my son standing on the porch where he once sold lemonade for 50 cents a cup. He asked if I hated him. I told him hatred is for strangers. Betrayal belongs to family. Then I handed him a copy of the trust and said, "Your father built this house for people who protect one another, not people who calculate what they can take." Melissa left town within 6 months. Last I heard, she was renting a small apartment across the state line and contesting tax liens from debts she thought Daniel would cover. The irony was almost too sharp to ignore. The woman who tried to make me pay rent ended up unable to keep up with her own. Daniel, after months of trying to repair what he broke, earned something back, though not through apology alone. He learned boundaries. He learned loyalty is action. He moved into a condo 12 miles away, visits every Sunday, and never steps into this house without asking first. As for me, I had the locks changed not out of fear but finality. I restored Robert's study exactly as it had been, replanted the rose beds Melissa wanted torn out for a second driveway, and hosted Thanksgiving at my table again, this time with guests who understood whose home they entered. That evening, as the dishes soaked and the last car pulled away, I stood at the kitchen window where Melissa once told me I could stay if I paid rent, and I laughed for the first time in months. Because I had given them 30 days, and in 30 days they lost everything they thought they had taken from me. My home. My name. My dignity. All still mine. Their greed did not remove me from this house. It removed them from my future. And that was the day they finally understood a quiet woman with a deed is never powerless. "If you want to keep living here, Evelyn, you'll pay rent like everyone else," my daughter-in-law said, and my son lowered his eyes as if humiliation were something ordinary served beside meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I remember the sound of silverware touching china. That was what stayed with me. Not the insult itself, but the casualness of it. As if a woman could be charged admission to the life she built. I was 71 years old, seated at a table my late husband Robert had refinished by hand in our garage one July when the heat climbed past 90 degrees. We had eaten Thanksgiving dinners there, signed birthday cards there, buried bad news there. And now Melissa sat in Robert's old chair and spoke to me as if I were a tenant overstaying a lease. Daniel cleared his throat and said, almost gently, "We all have expenses, Mom. property taxes, utilities. It would only be fair. Fair. I looked at my son and felt something colder than grief settle inside me. My husband had been dead 14 months. Long enough for condolence casseroles to stop coming. Long enough for people to assume a widow had adjusted. But grief doesn't leave. It just grows quieter. And in quiet you begin noticing things. The lock changed on Robert's study. Melissa referring to the house as our investment. Daniel asking whether I had considered downsizing. Little fractures. Hairline at first. Then all at once a break. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. Melissa smiled, mistaking silence for surrender. How much rent did you have in mind? I asked. She seemed relieved I was being reasonable. $1,200 a month, she said, as casually as discussing cable service. My own son nodded. $1,200 to stay in the home whose mortgage I had paid off 16 years earlier. I should have cried. I should have shouted. Instead I smiled. A small tired smile. Then I said the words they would spend weeks trying to undo. You can stay another 30 days instead. Neither of them understood. Not then. Melissa laughed, thinking I had made a joke. Daniel looked puzzled. But I had already made a decision. That night I stood in the kitchen after they went upstairs and touched the old brass key hidden in the sugar tin beside the stove. Robert had once told me, if people ever mistake kindness for weakness, remind them whose name is on the deed. I had not thought of those words in years. Yet there in the dark, with the refrigerator humming and rain tapping the window over the sink, I heard his voice as clearly as if he stood beside me. I opened the sugar tin, took out the key, and for the first time since Robert's funeral, I unlocked his study. Dust floated in the moonlight. His leather chair sat exactly where he left it. His file cabinet waited against the wall. I knew before opening it that Melissa had made one fatal mistake. She believed old women forget where power is kept. But some of us simply keep it quiet. Upstairs I heard footsteps crossing the hall. Their hall, they probably thought. Their house. Their future. I let them think they had one. Some games begin the moment your enemies grow comfortable. And the clock had just started. The next morning I rose before sunrise, the way I had done for most of my married life, and made coffee in Robert's old percolator because Melissa said the smell of fresh coffee from a real pot was old-fashioned. I let it fill the kitchen anyway. Some acts become rebellion when done in silence. The house was still. Daniel and Melissa slept upstairs while I sat at the table with Robert's key beside my cup and watched dawn soften the maple trees beyond the back patio. 30 days. The number had begun ticking in my mind like a second heartbeat. But revenge was never what stirred me. It was correction. There is a difference. By 8 o'clock Melissa came down in silk pajamas, glanced at me, and opened the refrigerator as if last night had been a practical discussion between adults. She asked whether I had thought about setting up automatic payments. I told her I had appointments to keep. She smiled without warmth and said she hoped I was being realistic. Realistic. Another word people use when they believe age has weakened you. I drove 12 miles into town under a pale October sky and parked outside Briggs & Coleman, the law office Robert had used for nearly 40 years. The brass plaque beside the door looked smaller than I remembered. Howard Briggs was older now, thinner. But his handshake still carried the calm of a man who had spent a lifetime around. Secrets. He listened without interruption while I told him everything. The rent demand. The changed locks. The comments about selling off part of the property. Then I placed Robert's key on his desk. He looked at it for a long moment and leaned back. Your husband was a careful man, Evelyn, he said. Sometimes careful men leave doors others do not know exist. We opened Robert's trust file that afternoon. There were amendments I had forgotten signing years earlier, after a cousin of Robert's lost his farm to a son who manipulated title transfers. Robert had insisted we add protections. I remembered arguing that such things were unnecessary among family. Howard did not smile when he said, families are why such clauses exist. As he reviewed the documents, a stillness settled over me. I had not imagined the danger. I had underestimated the shield already built around me. Yet Howard warned me patience mattered. Let them continue believing control belongs to them, he said. People reveal more when they feel secure. So I did what wounded women are rarely expected to do. I waited. Over the next week I watched carefully. Melissa brought home paint samples and left them spread across my kitchen counter. Daniel mentioned converting Robert's study into a home office. One evening I passed the den and heard Melissa whispering about refinancing options if title could be simplified. Simplified. She was already narrating ownership aloud. Every word fed the record Howard was building. And still I played the widow who did not understand. I asked harmless questions. I let Daniel explain property taxes to me as if I had never written those checks myself. I let Melissa believe her performance had softened me. But each night I returned to Robert's study, opened one more drawer, read one more letter in his precise hand, and began to understand something that changed me. My husband had not merely left me a house. He had left me leverage. On the 9th night, I found a sealed envelope marked to be opened if they ever mistake you for helpless. I held it under the lamplight, hearing footsteps above me, Melissa crossing the hallway overhead. I did not open it right away. Some truths deserve the right moment, and I was beginning to sense that moment was closer than either of them knew. On the 10th morning I opened Robert's envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note and a second key, smaller than the first, taped to a folded property ledger. Robert's handwriting had always been disciplined, every letter upright, every line measured. That morning it felt almost alive beneath my fingers. If you are reading this, he wrote, someone has confused your gentleness for surrender. Use the records in the cedar box. Trust the dates. Trust the signatures. Trust yourself. The cedar box was in the lower cabinet behind old tax binders, hidden so plainly only a spouse would know to look there. I unlocked it that evening after Daniel and Melissa left for a neighborhood dinner party. Inside were title abstracts, trust amendments, copies of canceled checks from improvements we had funded ourselves, and one notarized memorandum I had no memory of seeing. It granted me sole authority over occupancy decisions if any resident attempted coercive financial arrangements against my interest. Even Howard had not mentioned that clause yet. I sat very still reading it twice, then a third time. Outside, leaves skittered across the patio stones. Somewhere down the street children were riding bicycles before dark. Ordinary sounds. Yet I understood I was no longer merely defending a home. I was watching a deception expose itself. Melissa accelerated after that. Greed always mistakes patience for weakness. She began speaking openly about replacing the kitchen cabinets. She called a landscaper for an estimate on tearing out Robert's rose beds. One afternoon I came home from the grocery store and found painters measuring the den. Melissa said she thought it best to modernize before property values dipped. Before property values dipped. As though she already held title. I apologized for interrupting and carried in my bags like an old woman too timid to object. But that night I copied every invoice left on the counter and delivered them to Howard the next morning. He nodded without surprise. Let her keep building her case against herself, he said. Meanwhile Daniel had begun avoiding my eyes. Guilt rarely announces itself loudly. It leaks through silences. He lingered after dinner one evening while Melissa took a call upstairs and asked whether I had really meant what I said about 30 days. I told him deadlines have meaning only when ignored. He looked unsettled. For the first time I sensed not cruelty in him but drift. A man so used to yielding peace to his wife, he no longer recognized betrayal in his own conduct. Yet pity did not change what had to come. On day 14 Howard called with county records confirming something larger. Melissa had quietly consulted a mortgage broker about leveraging equity against this property using Daniel as presumptive co-owner. The application had been denied for missing authorization, but the attempt existed on record. That changed everything. What had been family manipulation now carried the scent of fraud. Howard suggested we move sooner. I said no. Not yet. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted Melissa arranging furniture in a house she would soon be ordered to leave. There is a particular calm that comes when fear burns out and clarity replaces it. I felt that calm as I polished silver for Sunday supper, and listened to Melissa discussing holiday hosting plans as though she were mistress of the house. Then she made one mistake too many. She laughed to a friend on speakerphone, not knowing I stood in the hallway, and said, "Once Evelyn starts paying rent, the rest will be easy." I did not move. I simply memorized every word. That night I wrote day 15 on a legal pad and underlined it once. Half the clock was gone. Upstairs doors closed. The house settled into midnight creaks. I returned to Robert's study, placed the memorandum beside the trust papers, and realized the game had changed. I was no longer waiting to see whether they would betray me. I was deciding when to let them discover they already had. Day 16 arrived with the first hard frost silvering the lawn, and Melissa complained at breakfast that the furnace felt inefficient for a house this old. She said old houses become money pits when sentimental people refuse to let go. I buttered toast and said nothing. By then silence had become its own instrument. Howard had advised patience, but patience was beginning to produce dividends neither of us expected. 2 days later Melissa hosted a luncheon for women from the neighborhood association. I offered to help set out sandwiches, and she accepted with the gracious superiority of someone already imagining herself owner. From the kitchen doorway I listened while she laughed about redesigning the first floor after certain transitions were finalized. One woman asked whether Daniel had inherited the property outright. Melissa answered before I could breathe. Practically speaking, yes. Evelyn will not be able to manage much longer. The word settled in me with a cold precision. There it was. Not private manipulation anymore. Public positioning. I served lemon bars and memorized every face at that table. Later that afternoon I drove to Howard's office with a written account of every statement. He read it slowly, tapped his pen against the desk, and said we were no longer documenting family tension. We were documenting a pattern. Then he showed me something he had quietly prepared. A notice of occupancy termination, fully lawful under trust authority, ready when I chose to sign. 30 days had once sounded symbolic. Now it felt procedural. Yet I still waited. There was something unfinished between Daniel and me. That Sunday he found me pruning the rose bushes Robert planted the year Daniel turned 10. The air smelled of damp earth and leaves. He asked whether I had ever considered selling the house voluntarily. I asked whether he had ever considered what it means to ask your mother for rent in the home where she raised you. He did not answer. Instead he stared at the shears in my hand and said, Melissa worried about our future. Our future. The phrase revealed everything. I saw then he had mistaken marriage for surrender, loyalty for compliance. I told him gently that fear can make decent people borrow the morals of stronger personalities. He looked almost wounded. For a moment I thought confession might come. But Melissa opened the back door and called him inside, and whatever conscience had stirred retreated with him. That night I signed the notice. Day 20 began with rain. Melissa spent the afternoon touring a model home development and returned carrying brochures for luxury townhomes, joking they might rent this place out one day for passive income. Passive income? I nearly smiled. Howard called after dinner and said the mortgage broker had agreed to provide a sworn statement regarding Melissa's prior inquiry into using this property as collateral. I sat in Robert's study after the call ended and felt a strange sadness pass through me, not for what I was about to do, but for how ordinary greed had made itself in my own family. Betrayal rarely arrives dressed as cruelty. More often it comes in practical language. Expenses. Fairness. Planning. Security. That was Melissa's genius and her mistake. She had tried to disguise hunger as reason. On day 22 I placed the signed notice in a manila envelope and tucked it beneath the blue willow platter in the dining room cabinet. I wanted it near the table where this began. That evening Melissa announced she had invited a contractor over the following week to discuss opening the wall between the kitchen and breakfast room. I asked whether she had considered permits. She laughed and said by then it would all be theirs anyway. Their confidence had ripened into carelessness. And carelessness is where power begins shifting. Before bed I crossed out day 22 on the legal pad and wrote beneath it, "Let them plan renovations for a house they are leaving." Then I turned off the lamp in Robert's study and understood the middle of the story had ended. The fall was coming now. Day 23 began with Melissa humming in the kitchen while she compared granite samples spread across my breakfast table. And I remember thinking how ambition often reveals itself most clearly when it believes victory is certain. She asked whether I preferred brushed nickel or matte black fixtures for the remodel, as though I had become some elderly mascot invited to comment on my own replacement. I said brushed nickel wears better over time. She smiled, taking it as surrender. By noon a contractor walked through the house measuring walls Robert had framed with his own hands. I stood near the pantry and listened while Melissa described knocking out the breakfast room partition, once title issues are simplified. Even the contractor glanced at me, uncertain. I offered coffee. Calm unsettles people more than protest. That evening Howard called and told me the sworn statement from the mortgage broker was notarized and filed. Then he said something I had not expected. Melissa's occupancy conduct, combined with attempted leverage against trust property, could justify immediate notice delivery. Immediate. The word sat heavy in the room after we hung up. Yet I still waited. Not from hesitation. From instinct. I had learned in long marriages and hard seasons that truth lands harder when people have fully displayed themselves first. The next day Daniel came home early, briefcase still in hand, and found me polishing silver in the dining room. He asked whether I ever regretted letting him and Melissa move in after Robert passed. I told him kindness is never the regret. Only misplaced trust wounds. He sat down across from me and for a moment looked 10 years old again. The boy who once asked permission before touching anything on this table. Then he said something that chilled me more than Melissa's insults ever had. He admitted they had already spoken to a realtor about the property's potential resale value. Spoken to a realtor. Before I was even gone. He said it softly, almost defensively, as though confessing to an indiscretion too small to matter. I set down the silver cloth and realized Daniel had become so accustomed to Melissa's framing that betrayal now sounded practical in his own mouth. I asked whether he remembered helping Robert lay the brick walkway out front one summer when he was 17. He nodded. Your father called that stewardship, I said. Not opportunity. Daniel had no answer. Upstairs Melissa called his name and the moment vanished again. That night I removed the manila envelope from beneath the willow platter and set it on Robert's desk. I did not sleep much. Some endings begin in insomnia. On day 25 Melissa hosted another planning conversation, this time over speakerphone with her sister, laughing about how, once Evelyn adjusts to assisted living, the house will finally function. Assisted living. I stood in the hall holding folded laundry, while those words passed over me like winter wind. She had never once discussed such a move with me. She had simply written it into the future she imagined stealing. I carried the laundry upstairs, placed fresh towels in their bathroom, and nearly smiled at the absurdity of serving the people preparing to displace me. But dignity often looks like composure no one understands until later. The next morning I met Howard at the courthouse annex and signed the final filing authorizing service. He slid the document toward me, and when I placed my name on the line I felt no triumph, only release. On the drive home church bells rang 11 times as I passed the town square. I remember counting them. 11 slow notes, each sounding like a marker laid down. When I pulled into the driveway Melissa was standing outside discussing hedge removal with the landscaper. She waved as if I had returned from errands. I waved back. Inside I crossed out day 26 on the legal pad and wrote one sentence beneath it. Let them decorate the stage. Tomorrow the curtain rises. And for the first time since this began, I believed the fall would not merely be deserved. It would be witnessed. Day 27 arrived colder than the rest, the kind of November morning when the windows hold a thin film of breath and every sound in the house carries farther than usual. Melissa was in unusually bright spirits, moving through the kitchen as if hosting some private victory. She mentioned the contractor would return after lunch to discuss tearing down the breakfast room wall. I nodded and poured coffee into Robert's old mug. There are moments when calm feels almost ceremonial. This was one. At 10:15 a sedan pulled into the driveway. Melissa assumed it was the contractor and opened the front door smiling. Instead Howard Briggs stepped onto the porch in his charcoal overcoat carrying a leather folio, and behind him stood a county process server. I remained seated at the dining room table, hands folded beside the blue willow platter where so many family meals had begun. Melissa's smile vanished in a way I will never forget. Not dramatically, quietly, like a light dimming. Howard asked if Daniel was home. By fortune or judgment, he had stayed to work remotely that day and appeared at the hallway just as the documents were presented. Notice of occupancy termination. Demand to vacate within 3 days under trust authority. Supporting claims attached. Melissa laughed at first, the brittle laugh people use when reality does not fit the story they have rehearsed. She said there had to be some mistake. Howard did not raise his voice. He simply recited the trust provisions, the occupancy violations, the attempted collateral inquiry, and the triggering conduct created by coercive rent demands against the trustee. Every word sounded heavier in that room than any accusation I could have spoken myself. Daniel turned toward me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in months. "Mom," he began, but no sentence followed. Melissa reached for the papers, scanning page after page, her hands trembling just enough to betray panic. Then came the sentence that ended whatever illusion remained. Under the trust forfeiture clause, Howard said, any contingent inheritance rights tied to Daniel's future interest are suspended pending judicial review due to hostile occupancy conduct. Melissa went pale. Money often explains what wounded pride cannot. She began insisting it was all misunderstanding, that discussions of rent had been hypothetical, that talk of refinancing had been exploratory. But records are indifferent to revision. Howard placed copies of emails, broker statements, and written witness accounts on the table where she once proposed charging me $1,200 a month. The symmetry was almost biblical. For a long minute no one moved. Even the refrigerator hum seemed louder. Then Daniel sank into a chair and covered his face. I had imagined anger when this day came. Instead I felt an immense stillness. Melissa tried a softer strategy next. She stepped toward me, voice shaking, saying families say foolish things under stress. I looked at her and realized this was the first time she had spoken to me without performance. Fear strips vanity quickly. I told her there would be no scene, only compliance. 3 days. She stared as if expecting mercy to alter consequence. But mercy had already been spent in warnings ignored. After they left the room to argue upstairs, Howard lingered beside Robert's study door and quietly said, "They thought possession was power. They forgot authority survives paperwork." By late afternoon word had begun traveling, because small towns have invisible wires. The landscaper never returned. The contractor canceled his follow-up. Even the women from Melissa's association luncheon suddenly found reasons not to call. Public unraveling had started before sunset. That evening Daniel came down alone and asked whether anything could stop what had begun. I told him some doors close the moment people decide entitlement is love. After he went upstairs I crossed out day 27 on the legal pad, and wrote only 2 words beneath it. They know. Outside, frost silvered the rose beds again. Inside, for the first time since Robert died, this house felt as though it recognized its rightful silence returning. The first night after service of the notice, no one slept much. I could hear drawers opening and closing upstairs, the muffled cadence of urgent whispers slipping beneath the floorboards. Panic has its own acoustics. By dawn Melissa was already in the kitchen in yesterday's sweater, face pale, stirring coffee she did not drink. She tried a different voice with me that morning, softer, almost intimate. She said perhaps we should all sit down and work out something reasonable. Reasonable. The same word that had once been used to ask me for rent. I buttered toast and told her legal deadlines have a way of clarifying reason. She did not answer. Daniel left early to meet an attorney friend, though by noon he returned looking older somehow, shoulders lowered by the simple discovery that paperwork does not bend for wounded entitlement. He stood in Robert's study doorway and asked whether his father had truly planned for something like this. I told him wise men plan for storms even in clear weather. He looked around the room as though seeing his father in the grain of every bookshelf. Then he asked the question I knew would come. "Did you ever mean to throw us out?" I said no. I meant to stop being pushed out. There is a difference children do not always understand until too late. Melissa did not accept defeat as quietly. By afternoon she was calling relatives, shaping a rescue through narrative. I overheard fragments. Evelyn is confused. Howard manipulated her. We are being blindsided. But truth had moved faster than she had. One by one the people she called responded with caution instead of outrage. The poison of public embarrassment had already entered the room. That evening the Homeowners Association president, a woman named Carol who had once attended Melissa's luncheons, left a voicemail asking whether recent allegations regarding attempted elder coercion were accurate, because concerns had been raised. Melissa played the message twice, then sat staring at her phone as though betrayal had visited her, not the other way around. I almost pitied her then. Almost. On day 28 moving boxes appeared in the upstairs hall. Daniel packed books in silence. Melissa moved in bursts of indignation. folding clothes too hard, muttering about appeals, about countersuits, about misunderstandings becoming legal theater. Yet every hour shrank her certainty. Around noon she came to me holding a framed wedding portrait she had taken from the guest room and asked where she was supposed to go. The question startled me because it was the first honest one she had asked in months. I said the same thing every adult learns when plans built on someone else's property collapse. You begin again where you can afford to. Her eyes flashed, then dimmed. No retort came. That afternoon Daniel asked if he could walk with me to the mailbox. We moved slowly down Robert's brick path under bare maple branches, and he admitted he had ignored too many small betrayals because opposing Melissa always seemed harder than disappointing me. I told him cowardice often wears the face of peacekeeping. He winced as though struck by truth alone. When we returned, Melissa was loading her car and speaking in hushed urgency to her sister about short-term rentals across the county line. The woman who once priced granite for my kitchen was searching online for furnished apartments by the week. There was a harsh poetry in that. By evening only one day remained. I made chicken soup, enough for 3, and set bowls at the same table where this began. None of us said much. Yet silence had changed shape. It was no longer oppressive. It was reckoning. After dinner Daniel lingered while Melissa went upstairs. He looked at the legal pad still resting near the sideboard and asked if I had truly been counting days. I turned it toward him. Day 28 was crossed out. Beneath it I had written, "Pride packs slower than truth." He read it twice and gave a sad laugh. Later, after lights dimmed and the house settled, I stood at the kitchen window watching frost gather again over Robert's rose beds. Tomorrow they would leave. But something larger had already departed. The illusion that motherhood requires endless tolerance had finally moved out first. Day 29 opened with a stillness so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway mark each quarter hour. Melissa was already loading the last boxes into her car when I came downstairs. Her heels clicked across the hardwood she once planned to refinish in a lighter stain. Even then she moved with remnants of pride, chin lifted, though the performance had cracks. Daniel carried lamps, framed prints, winter coats. He did not speak much. Some grief enters a man only when consequences acquire weight. Around 10 the county deputy returned, not because anyone resisted, but because procedure completes what emotion complicates. Seeing the patrol car at the curb drew curtains twitching up and down the street. Quiet neighborhoods have their own audience. Melissa noticed and stiffened. Public witness stung her more than legal papers ever had. Before noon she asked to speak with me privately in the breakfast room, the same room she once intended to open into a designer kitchen. She stood by the window looking out at Robert's rose beds and said perhaps she had pushed too hard. Perhaps she had misread boundaries. It was as close to apology as she could travel. Then she asked whether I would reconsider the inheritance suspension if she withdrew all disputes. There it was again. Not remorse. Calculation dressed in humility. I told her consequences are not bargaining chips once activated. She looked at me for a long moment, almost studying the woman she had mistaken for frail. Then she said something I did not expect. I thought Daniel would inherit everything anyway. I answered softly, you thought inheritance was the house. It was character. That ended the conversation. By 1 o'clock the moving van was packed. Daniel carried down the last box from Robert's study, old tax files I had agreed he could store elsewhere, and paused at the front door. His eyes were red though he had not cried in front of me since childhood. He said he had spent months believing he was protecting a marriage, and only now understood he had been abandoning a mother. I told him repentance begins where excuses end. He nodded once. Melissa, meanwhile, made one final attempt at dignity through defiance. As she reached her car she turned and said the neighborhood would talk. I told her yes, but not in the way she imagined. She looked almost angry enough to answer, then saw 2 women from the association walking across the street and chose silence instead. The deputy signed off the occupancy completion, tipped his hat to me, and drove away. Such an ordinary gesture for such an extraordinary ending. By mid-afternoon the house was empty except for me. Empty yet fuller somehow. Their bedroom stood stripped of comforters and perfume bottles. The upstairs hall echoed when I walked it. In Melissa's former closet, a single forgotten scarf hung from a hook like a remnant of a failed claim. I left it there until evening. Some symbols deserve one last hour. At 4, Daniel returned alone, not to stay, but to hand me a ring of keys he had copied months ago without asking. I placed them on the table and slid them back. Keep them, I said. But never use them without invitation. His face tightened with something between shame and gratitude. Then he left. Just before dusk, Howard called with news the association board had opened ethics review proceedings concerning Melissa's conduct after complaints from 2 luncheon guests who felt misled. Her social standing, once curated so carefully, was unraveling under its own vanity. I listened, thanked him, and hung up. I did not feel vindicated, only settled. As darkness came, I lit the lamp in Robert's study, opened the legal pad, crossed out day 29, and wrote, "The house is quiet enough to hear truth breathing again." Then I walked room to room, turning on lights, not because I feared emptiness, but because I wanted every window glowing when the neighbors passed. Let them see the widow still home. Let them see who remained. Outside, frost silvered the lawn once more, but inside, warmth returned in small familiar ways. And standing at the front door before locking it for the night, I understood the eviction had not been their punishment. It had been the restoration. The morning after the house returned to silence, I expected triumph and felt instead a kind of solemn clarity, as if justice had weight as well as relief. I woke before dawn and walked barefoot through rooms that seemed larger without tension living in them. The staircase no longer carried whispered plotting at midnight. The kitchen no longer held Melissa's perfume or the brittle edge of her rehearsed politeness. Only coffee, old pine floors, and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ordinary things. Honest things. Yet consequences were still unfolding. Howard called mid-morning with updates from the court clerk. Melissa's challenge to the occupancy termination had been withdrawn before filing, but the inheritance suspension remained active pending trust review, and because of the documented coercion claim, any future petition Daniel made to restore contingent rights would require judicial approval. Robert's poison pill clause had done exactly what he designed it to do. It did not merely defend property. It exposed motives. That afternoon, Daniel came by alone carrying a bakery box from the town shop I used to take him to after Little League games. Apple turnovers. My favorite. He stood awkwardly at the doorway until I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight moving across the worn wood, and he confessed Melissa had blamed him for everything after they moved into a furnished apartment across the county line. Their arguments were constant. Her part-time staging job offer had quietly disappeared after questions spread through town. 2 board members from the Homeowners Association had resigned rather than defend her conduct. And worst of all to Melissa, people had begun repeating a phrase she could not outrun. The woman who tried to charge her mother-in-law rent. Reputations once cracked make a distinct sound when they fall. Daniel asked if I had planned all this from the night of the rent demand. I told him no. I planned only not to surrender. The rest was built from what their greed kept revealing. He looked down and said he used to think strength meant whoever controlled the room. Now he suspected it meant whoever could remain still while truth did its work. Robert would have liked that, I told him. For the first time since childhood, Daniel smiled without defense. Before leaving, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $1,200, the amount they had once demanded from me. Rent returned as apology. I stared at it a long while. Then I endorsed it over to the County Elder Legal Aid Fund and mailed it the next morning. Some symbols should not be deposited. They should be transformed. Days passed. The legal review finalized. Daniel's inheritance interest was partially restored only after he signed formal acknowledgement of the trust terms and renounced any occupancy claim without my invitation. Melissa was excluded entirely under the forfeiture provisions. Financially, she lost the inheritance she had quietly assumed was future security. Socially, she lost the polished standing she curated so carefully. Legally, every attempt she made to frame herself as victim dissolved against documented evidence. The punishment was never dramatic. It was cleaner than that. It was consequence. A week later, I hosted Sunday supper for the first time since Robert died. Just Daniel and me. Pot roast, green beans, warm rolls. Halfway through dinner, he asked whether I would ever forgive Melissa. I told him forgiveness is not restoration. Some people are released from resentment without being invited back into trust. He sat with that a while. Then he said he was filing for separation. I did not react at first. Life had already taught me endings arrive quietly. But later, washing dishes, I realized the 30-day clock had not only removed intruders from my house. It had broken an illusion my son had been living inside. That night I walked to Robert's study, opened the legal pad one final time, and beneath all the crossed-out days I wrote, they tried to make me a tenant in my own life. Instead they learned whose house remembered its owner. I closed the pad and placed it in the cedar box with Robert's letter. Some stories end when villains leave. This one ended when order returned. And in that return was something better than revenge. It was authority reclaimed. Winter settled in by the time the legal dust truly cleared, and with it came a rhythm I had almost forgotten could belong to a house. Mornings returned to coffee at sunrise, afternoons to small chores Robert used to call the maintenance of gratitude, evenings to lamplight in his study without dread pressing at the walls. Yet consequences, once set in motion, continued moving long after the front door closed behind Melissa. In December Howard invited me to his office for the final trust review order. Snow flurries drifted over Main Street as I walked from the parking lot, and I remember thinking how clean the town looked under first snow, as if even old scandals were softened at a distance. But inside Howard's office there was nothing soft about the ruling. Melissa's forfeiture was permanent. Her documented coercive conduct, attempted misuse of trust property, and misrepresentations to third parties barred any derivative claim through Daniel. Financially, what she had assumed was future security vanished in 4 stamp pages. Howard slid the order toward me and simply said, "Your husband built stronger walls than lumber." When I returned home, Daniel was waiting in the driveway. He had started coming on Sundays, then some Wednesdays too, each visit less burdened by apology and more shaped by effort. He told me he had signed a lease on a modest condominium 12 miles away, and filed separation papers the week before. Melissa had contested little. According to him, she had spent more energy trying to salvage reputation than marriage. There was a sadness in hearing it but not surprise. Some unions survive affection. Others survive ambition. When ambition fails, little remains. A few days later the county paper ran a brief legal notice summary as part of routine filings. Most people would never read such columns, but in small towns someone always does. By the next church luncheon, women who once praised Melissa's hosting skills spoke in lowered voices about greed and disgrace. No scandal announced itself loudly. It simply settled around her name. Then came the final irony. The mortgage broker who had once fielded Melissa's inquiry testified in an unrelated licensing review, and her conduct was referenced in a professional complaint tied to misrepresentation. She lost the staging license application she had counted on for income. Financial penalty, social penalty, professional penalty, each one earned without a raised voice from me. That, more than anything, satisfied something deep and old in me. Not revenge. Proportion. One Sunday after New Year Daniel arrived carrying a folder, and asked if I would look at something. Inside were transfer forms removing him voluntarily from any future dispute over occupancy rights, and acknowledging my sole lifetime authority over the property beyond contest. I asked why he felt compelled. He said because I spent too long behaving as if what was yours was negotiable. I signed the witness line and looked at my son, really looked, and saw not the man who had lowered his eyes at the dinner table months before, but someone chastened into adulthood. We ate pot roast that night while snow gathered against the windows, and before leaving Daniel paused in the foyer where Melissa once stood demanding terms. He touched the doorframe Robert had installed himself and said, "I thought keeping peace meant agreeing with whoever pushed hardest. I know better now." After he left I walked room to room turning off lights, the same ritual I had kept for decades. In Robert's study I opened the cedar box one last time and reread his note. Trust the signatures. Trust yourself. I smiled because in the end both had held. The woman who tried to make me pay to remain in my own home had lost inheritance, status, and the illusion she could rewrite ownership through manipulation. My son had lost a false marriage but regained a conscience. And I had not merely kept a house. I had reclaimed standing. Weeks later I replaced the brass plate by the mailbox. Harper House, established 1981. A small thing perhaps. But names matter. Authority likes visible reminders. On the first warm day of spring, I replanted Robert's roses where Melissa planned a driveway extension. As I pressed soil around new roots, I understood the story had moved beyond defense. This was restoration with witnesses. They had tried to reduce me to a tenant in my own life. Instead, they left carrying boxes while I remained holding title, memory, and the final word. And there is no quieter triumph than staying where others plotted to remove you. Spring brought a softness back to the property that felt almost like blessing. Dogwoods bloomed along the side fence Robert once painted every other summer, and the roses I replanted took hold stronger than I expected. There is something fitting about roots recovering after intrusion. By then Daniel had settled into a smaller life in his condominium, simpler and quieter, and he came every Sunday without fail carrying groceries or some unnecessary but touching repair project. One afternoon he replaced a loose porch rail Robert had meant to fix before his heart gave out. We worked side by side in companionable silence until he said, almost casually, Melissa reached out. I kept sanding the rail and asked what she wanted. He said she was leaving the state for Arizona, staying near a cousin, trying to start over after debts mounted and the separation finalized. Then he added she asked whether I still spoke of her with anger. I smiled at that. The vanity of believing one remains central in the thoughts of those one wronged. I told Daniel anger is too expensive to keep on retainer. Consequence had already done what anger never could. A week later, through no effort of my own, I learned more. Carol from the Homeowners Association stopped by with lemon bread and neighborhood gossip disguised as concern. Melissa, it seemed, had tried to rebuild her image in a neighboring county only to have background questions follow. The professional circles she once prized were smaller than she imagined. People compare notes. Reputations travel. Again, I felt no thrill in hearing it, only the sober satisfaction that falsehood does not retire gracefully. Yet the deeper payoff came not from Melissa's continued unraveling, but from what changed in Daniel. One Sunday he arrived with an old cedar chest from his condominium trunk. Inside were childhood things he had saved for decades. Little League trophies, school ribbons, a Father's Day card he made Robert at age 9. At the bottom was a photograph of the three of us standing in front of this house the day we moved in, all sunburned and smiling beside a borrowed pickup truck. Daniel stared at it a long while and said, I nearly helped someone turn this into real estate instead of home. I answered softly, but you did not. Not in the end. That mattered. Then he surprised me by asking if he could begin helping with the trust administration someday, not from entitlement but stewardship. The word caught in my chest because it was Robert's word. I told him stewardship begins with respect, not expectation. He nodded as though receiving instruction long overdue. That summer I hosted a family barbecue for the first time in years. Cousins came. Neighbors came. Even Howard Briggs stopped by in rolled shirt sleeves carrying peach cobbler his wife made. Laughter moved through the backyard where Melissa once planned a second driveway. At dusk Daniel stood by the grill talking with Howard about estate law, of all things, and I thought how strange life is that betrayal could circle back into restoration so complete. As the evening wound down, Howard raised a glass of iced tea and joked that not many women execute a trust defense with better timing than a trial lawyer. Everyone laughed. I did too. But beneath the humor was recognition. People had witnessed the reversal. Not rumor. Fact. Later, after guests left and fireflies hovered over the lawn, Daniel lingered by the porch and said something I have never forgotten. You did not just save the house, Mom. You taught me who should have been leaving all along. When he drove away, I sat alone in the porch swing Robert built and watched moonlight settle over the brick path. I thought of the night I first unlocked his study after being told to pay rent in my own home. How small and cornered I had felt. And how quietly power had returned. Not through fury but through structure, patience, and one deadline spoken without trembling. The woman who tried to displace me had lost money, standing, legal claim, and the son she thought she controlled. I had regained authority, my son's respect, and a house once threatened now more secure than ever. Yet one piece remained. I still had Robert's note in the cedar box, and on the anniversary of his death I added a line beneath his words. They mistook kindness for weakness. They learned otherwise. I closed the lid and knew only the final reckoning remained to be spoken aloud. By autumn the story people whispered about in grocery aisles and church foyers had become something steadier than scandal. It had become caution. Melissa's attempt to reinvent herself in Arizona ended before it began when a civil judgment tied to the reimbursement order followed her credit history and collapsed a condominium application she had counted on. The financial penalties from legal fees and damages had not ruined her overnight, but they narrowed every path she once assumed would open. The woman who measured life by appearances now lived with the arithmetic of consequence. Then came the final public unmasking. The Homeowners Association Ethics Review concluded and circulated a formal finding that Melissa had misrepresented an elder occupancy dispute while serving in a volunteer leadership role. Her membership privileges were revoked permanently. A small administrative act perhaps, yet in communities built on reputation, such things echo loudly. When Carol called to tell me, I set down the phone and simply looked out at Robert's roses moving in the wind. No triumph, just completion. Weeks later, the county court closed the trust review with final language restoring Daniel's contingent inheritance only under my sole discretion and affirming Melissa had no present or future claim, direct or indirect, to any trust asset. Howard framed the order for me as a joke, though we both understood it was something more. It was a verdict not merely against greed but against presumption. I hung it in Robert's study beside the old land survey from 1981. Paper defending paper. Promise defending promise. Then came the moment I had not anticipated would move me most. At the church harvest supper, attended by half the town, the pastor asked me to say grace because he said, some homes survive storms because the women inside refused to surrender them. I stood before neighbors who had heard fragments of what happened and spoke a simple blessing. But afterward an older widow I barely knew took my hand and whispered, I wish I had known 30 years ago I could say no to my own children. That was when I understood this had become larger than my house. It had become testimony. Daniel, meanwhile, changed in ways I once feared impossible. He petitioned the trust voluntarily to add a stewardship clause requiring any future heir live elsewhere for 5 years before occupancy rights could even be considered. When Howard explained the filing, I laughed and asked why he would limit himself. Daniel answered, because no one should ever confuse inheritance with entitlement again. In that moment Robert's legacy stood alive in our son more clearly than in any document. Near Christmas Daniel brought me a brass plaque wrapped in brown paper. We mounted it at the end of the brick path where the mailbox stands. Harper House. Family held in trust. EST 1981. Melissa had once tried to make me pay to remain here. Now the property announced to every passerby exactly what she failed to understand. This house was not available for takeover. It was held, protected, named. One icy January afternoon, a certified letter arrived from Melissa through counsel offering to waive all remaining disputes in exchange for a private letter from me supporting her character rehabilitation for a licensing board. I read it twice and almost admired the instinct to bargain even after defeat. Then I wrote one sentence in reply. Integrity is restored through conduct, not endorsements. Howard mailed it that afternoon. That was the last request ever made of me. Finality rarely arrives with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of further intrusion. On the anniversary of the dinner when rent was demanded, I set the dining table with the good china again. Daniel came. Howard came. Carol brought pie. After supper I stood and lifted a glass. Not for revenge but for order restored. I said, a year ago I was told I could remain in my own home only on someone else's terms. Tonight the people who made that demand rent apartments, answer judgments, and live with the names they made for themselves. I remain here under my own roof at my own table, on the land my husband and I paid for inch by inch. No one applauded at first. Then Howard raised his glass and said, to the woman who gave them 30 days. Laughter broke over the room. Honest laughter. The kind that closes wounds. Later, after everyone left, I walked alone through the darkened house touching door frames, chair backs, the mantel Robert built. Every room answered with belonging. In the study I opened the cedar box one last time and placed inside the legal pad with all the crossed out days. On the final page I wrote, they tried to turn the owner into a tenant. Instead they forfeited inheritance, reputation and place. I kept the house. I kept my name. I kept the final word. Then I locked the box, returned the key to the sugar tin, and turned off the lamp. That was the end of it. Melissa was publicly exposed, financially diminished, legally defeated, and erased from any claim she once schemed to seize. Daniel returned not as heir apparent but as humbled son. And I, the widow they mistook for helpless, did not merely survive the betrayal. I outlasted it, documented it, and made the people who caused it leave carrying their own consequences. Some houses remember who built them. This one remembered me.